So welcome back everyone to the fourth video of the Southern Cemetery Tour. So far, we've found the final resting places of John Alcock, John Henry Davis, Daniel Adamson, Charles Sarkra, L.S. Lowry, John Rylands and Billy Meredith. Luckily, my next visit isn't too far away from my last. So what we're going to do now is jump back a little bit in time and go into the crime of the late 19th century in Manchester. And we're leaving Billy Meredith over there and we're heading back towards the centre of the cemetery, but not too close to the centre. So this is the grave of Jerome Caminada, perhaps the most famous copper in Manchester's history, dubbed the real-life Sherlock Holmes. And he was born in 1844 on Deansgate to an Irish mum and an Italian dad. Now back in those days, Deansgate was a completely different place to what it is today. It was it was a very poor neighbourhood, full of slum houses, very, very poor people, pubs where illegal things happen all the time, like fights and animal baiting. And it was, you could almost say it was the epicentre of Manchester's criminal underworld. Now imagine growing up surrounded by that, like Jerome did. You're either going to fall into it very easily and just become part of it, or you're going to kind of rebel against it and want to do something about it. Now for us, thankfully, Jerome Caminada was the second type of person. So his upbringing probably did play a part in his joining the police force at the age of 24 and working eventually as a detective, part of a new team of detectives working out of the Manchester Town Hall. Now apparently he's supposed to be responsible for about 1,225 arrests and the closure of around 400 pubs around the city. After many years, Caminada also caught Bob Horridge, who used to stalk the slum alleyways around Angel Meadows, robbing and burgling people violently. Horridge was a blacksmith by day, but his violent crimes led to him being labelled as public enemy number one. Now Caminada developed such a legendary reputation amongst ordinary people in the papers, but also in the criminal underworld. Criminals spoke about him with a kind of reverence, kind of awe, respect, you know. And so much so in fact that in 1892, when a 16-year-old called William Willen stabbed another 16-year-old called Peter Kennedy in Ancoats in a kind of scuttler gang war type thing, Willen wrote to Caminada and begged him, said, please stop me going to the gallows, please save my life, stop me being killed for this crime that I committed. And Caminada agreed. Caminada said, yeah, you're a bit too young to die for this crime. So there was a public campaign, a very large public campaign, and Caminada was part of that, and eventually the Home Secretary overturned the death sentence for Willen. Now funnily enough, Billy Willen would go on to marry Caminada's daughter Florence. Now they died and they're buried on the other side of the city in Phillips Park Cemetery, whereas Jerome died in Moss Side at the age of 70 and is buried here. So next I'm heading to the grave of someone called Joseph Sunlight, and to do that I've got to head all the way across to the other side of the cemetery, to the Jewish section. It's a bit of a walk this. I probably should have planned this better. I'm pinging around all over the cemetery today. Anyway, it's quite nice. I quite like walking through cemeteries, not in a morbid way. But they are just well manicured parks at the end of the day. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a beautiful day. It's really warm. It's autumnal. So yeah, let's make the most of this. So this is the Jewish section. It's on the very western side of the cemetery, and as you can see, many of the graves are actually lying flat on the ground. Now that's because in Jewish tradition everybody's equal in the eyes of God, although some people are more equal than others. Anyway, so Joseph Sunlight is down here on the left hand side. I think hopefully it's not too difficult to find. Oh, here it is. So this is the grave of Joseph Sunlight, and it's amazing really because it's so simple and understated. especially when you consider that this guy was an architect with a keen eye for stylish and aspirational design. So he was born in 1889 in what is today Belarus with the name Joseph Schlimshlevich. His father was a cotton merchant, and since Manchester was the centre of the cotton world at the time, the family decided to move here and try and make a good living. Like many people at the time, the Schlimshleviches changed their name to a more English sounding name, Sunlight, most likely named after Port Sunlight, a new model village over in the Wirral. Now remember, back then, and well, still very much today, there's a lot of ignorance and hatred about people from different cultures here in England. So it's not surprising that this young Jewish family wanted to minimise that. By the age of 19, Joseph had his own architectural firm in St Anne's Square, and by the mid-20s he had designed and built over 100 houses in the well-to-do district of Prestwich, north of the city. He built other non-residential buildings too, but the jewel has got to be Sunlight House on Quay Street. So Sunlight House is one of them buildings you've probably seen many times if you go through the city centre of Manchester, but you've probably never thought very much about it. It's a very simple Art Deco building, but it was the tallest building in the city at the time when it was built, and also the very first skyscraper in the north of England. And it could have been even taller. Today it's just 14 stories high, but Sunlight wanted to extend it with a 35-storey tower, something that resembled those popping up in Chicago and other cities across the United States. Interestingly, he's also behind the old synagogue in Fallowfield, which he modelled after the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Now he eventually became an MP for Shrewsbury in the 1923 election, but lost his seat a year later in the 1924 election. If you think we've got problems now, well, back then they had 3 elections in 2 years. So Joseph Sunlight died a very wealthy man in 1978. And his wish was to be buried in a mausoleum in the roof of Sunlight House. Now unfortunately that never happened, and instead of course he was buried here in this incredibly modest grave. So far we've been looking at men who succeeded in what they've chosen to do with their lives, succeeded very well. Now I'm heading back to the centre circle of the cemetery, just off the centre circle of the cemetery, to look at something very different. The grave of a little girl whose life and future was stolen from her at a very young age. So finally, this is Lesley Ann Downey, the 4th victim of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, the Moors murderers. Now at the age of just 10, Lesley Ann was abducted from a fairground in Beswick on Boxing Day in 1964. She was the youngest of the 5 people Brady and Hindley killed. Now what I'm not going to do is talk about the murder in great detail, mostly because it's not very nice, but also because it's the type of thing the egomaniac Ian Brady would have loved people to just keep talking about him and keep dishing out all the details into the future. But it was Lesley Ann's murder and the circumstances around that which would eventually bring down Brady and Hindley. Downey's death was not quick or painless. She was also the first one to be killed at the pair's new home in Hattersley, rather than up on Saddleworth Moor like the first 3. Brady and Hindley were arrested for the murder of their next victim, Edward Evans, and during the police investigation, detectives found a ticket for a left luggage box at Manchester Central Station. Inside the suitcase, stored at the station, were photographs of Lesley Ann tied up and a 13-minute tape recording of her being tortured. Now eventually the police figured out the extent of Brady and Hindley's crimes, and that 4 children had been buried on the moors above Saddleworth, high above the Greenfield Brook Valley. Now in fact, Lesley Ann's was the first body to be recovered up there. So the Moors murders shocked and horrified the world, and in particular Manchester. Now, personally speaking, I'm from Saddleworth, and I remember growing up there, the shadow that the murders cast over Saddleworth decades after they'd taken place. Now funnily enough, I used to work in Gorton as well for a number of years, and I know that it's a community that hasn't still quite come to terms with what happened that period in history. People don't really talk about it, they don't want to talk about it. And I don't blame them, to be honest with you. It's a horrific thing to happen on your doorstep, especially if you were a kid in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, around that time. But that is the everlasting impact of the Moors murders on Manchester and Saddleworth. So there you go, kind of a miserable, sad end to this video, unfortunately. But what stories we've uncovered, eh? Join me in the next one. There's a few more graves I like to look at in here, and I want to show you them. So it's going to be another video that I'm going to come out with soon. So like and subscribe if you want to see that, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much. Bye.